Protest backlash. A senior minister blasts demonstrators as reckless and selfish. How Indigenous campaigners have responded. In the US, there's now dancing in the streets after days of unrest. Washington witnessed its biggest demonstration so far.
Oh my God, the horse is bolted!
A runaway police horse trampled crowds in London. Across Europe and beyond, the global movement is growing. And also tonight, the search for a 3-metre great white shark which killed a surfer in the shallows.
This is SBS World News with Ricardo Goncalves.
Good evening. Calls for racial equality and justice are gathering momentum in the US. Thousands of people have taken to the streets across the country in the most sweeping demonstration since the killing of unarmed African-American George Floyd.
On the 12th day of protests, cries for justice rising from the nation in New York. Swelling crowds in the French Quarter of New Orleans. Demonstrators streaming across San Francisco's Golden Gate Bridge and in Los Angeles.
George Floyd!
But protesters nowhere more strategically located than in the capital.
Ain't no power like the power of the people, because the power of the people don't stop.
Marching over the new Black Lives Matter mural ordered by Washington DC's mayor, multiracial, young and old.
Even though I thought I was educated, I was not, and there's a lot of work to do.
As a black woman dealing with sexism and dealing with racism, I'm combating double the trouble.
Days ago, these streets cleared by force to make way for the president's photo opportunity. The White House ringed by newly installed higher fencing. From behind it, President Trump tweeting, "Law and order." Then, much smaller crowd in DC than anticipated. Nationwide, thousands undeterred, embracing the moment from Manhattan to Atlanta, Georgia. Rallies with a broad agenda.
We need to have economic justice so that everyone can have access to capital, so that people can build buildings and build their lives.
Amid demands for urgent police accountability, 2 New York officers charged with assault less than 36 hours after a 75-year-old man was shoved to the ground during a protest.
I'm not choosing sides. My job is to prosecute those who have violated the law. Plain and simple.
And in Philadelphia, an officer charged with assault after video posted online showed him hitting a protester in the head with a baton. The police union vowing to support the officer. For the family, unexpectedly vaulted into the centre of national life, another chapter in their journey of grief. A homecoming for George Floyd to his birthplace of Rayford, North Carolina. At this private memorial, America's fractured state inescapable.
Just in case you were wondering, this is not how you use a Bible. Just to clarify, just to make sure we all on the same page here.
The funeral for George Floyd will be held in Houston on Wednesday. His legacy growing. Democrats in Congress preparing to introduce legislation that would include a ban on chokeholds and create a national registry of police misconduct. Pruluan, SBS World News.
And still to come, when 2 crises collide, the US has more confirmed COVID-19 cases than anywhere else in the world. As protests continue, is America set for a huge spike in infections? We'll have that story shortly. Back home, and Indigenous campaigners have called it a kick in the guts after a huge outpouring of support for the Black Lives Matter movement. Today, a senior federal minister took aim at the tens of thousands of protesters. Matthias Cormann labelling them reckless, self-indulgent and selfish. The comments triggered an angry response, but the minister's not backing down, and now senior health officials have a warning for anyone who was at the demonstrations.
It was a nationwide call for justice, one a global pandemic couldn't silence. Tens of thousands marched in cities and towns across the country with the same cry. The mass protests went ahead despite pleas from authorities for people not to attend. Today, a senior minister scathing of those who took part in the largely peaceful demonstrations.
I think it is incredibly selfish, it's incredibly self-indulgent, and yes, I mean, it does impose unnecessary and unacceptable risk onto the community.
The comments slammed by the opposition as
tone deaf and I think politically expedient, quite frankly. Matthias Common should know better than to describe these protests yesterday, this cry from the heart of many thousands of people across the world and in Australia.
Also raising the ire of Indigenous protesters.
Quite frankly, offensive, and as an Aboriginal person feel like they're a kick in the guts while we're already down.
Despite the criticism, Mr Cormann this afternoon doubled down on his comments.
But we're going to have a mass gathering of tens of thousands of people in complete breach of the rules that apply to anybody else. It is absolutely reckless and irresponsible, and it shouldn't be happening.
And I'm sure that each and every person at that march would have downloaded the COVID Safe app. If they haven't, well, they were being irresponsible. Now, they shouldn't have marched in those numbers. They should not.
The Deputy Chief Medical Officer says health authorities are nervous about the potential consequences in weeks to come.
It's unfortunate that this mass gathering happened, but I understand why it happened. The issue now is that we are on more of an alert than we would have otherwise been.
Urging protesters to get tested immediately if they become unwell. Indigenous activists say these demonstrations are the culmination of generations of systemic injustice and racism, and they're seizing on this moment as the world's attention remains on the Black Lives Matter movement.
In Australia, racism to us is also a pandemic. That's something we live with. As an activist at the front line, it's absolutely crucial that we maintain this momentum.
Strengthened resolve for demonstrators vowing to march on. Pablo Vinales, SBS World News.
In the UK, largely peaceful demonstrations descended into clashes outside the Prime Minister's residence as mounted police tried to clear away protesters. Tens of thousands of people had turned out in London and other major cities across Europe and Asia, despite authorities urging people to stay home because of health concerns.
On the banks of London's River Thames, they swarmed the US Embassy, also turning up on the Prime Minister's doorstep. A movement stretching from Minneapolis to Whitehall. Thousands of protesters standing in silence, en masse holding up a Black Power salute outside the British Parliament.
The UK is not innocent. Everything you see around you is built off the backs of black and brown bodies.
I guess I'm here because I don't think there's anywhere more important to be today.
But as nightfall approached, police attempted to drive away protesters from Downing Street. An officer appearing to knock herself off her horse before it trampled a protester, both receiving medical care. As the protests were wrapping up, the trouble began, groups throwing bottles and flares at officers as others called for calm. A stain on what had been a largely peaceful day.
What we are fighting for is to stop institutional racism.
The government had earlier tried appealing for people to stay at home. Masks and gloves were handed out, but as the numbers swelled, the ability to social distance disappeared.
We are in a health pandemic across the United Kingdom, and coronavirus is a deadly virus. And of course, I'd say to those that want to protest, please don't.
But many did, and among them a famous face attending the march in London on crutches following knee surgery. Street artist Banksy also publishing a new artwork with the American flag alight and 4 paragraphs describing the global situation as a white problem. In Luton, north of London, police were urged to take a knee. The officers seemingly unmoved. But it's a global movement that appears to be building and shows no signs of slowing even in the face of the pandemic. In Paris, hundreds gathered outside the US Embassy and on the lawns of the Eiffel Tower. Police in Germany arresting a small group of protesters who injured a police officer as thousands had gathered in silence in Berlin. Tokyo also joining the global calls against police brutality after a Kurdish man there was reportedly shoved to the ground by officers. Virginia Langerberg, SBS World News.
Queensland police are tonight questioning a 14-year-old boy who they say was behind the wheel of a stolen car when it overturned, killing 4 other children. The single vehicle crash happened in the North Queensland city of Townsville. The victims were all teenagers, the oldest just 18.
Allegedly driving down the wrong side of the road at 4:30 this morning. Police say the stolen Kia Sorento clipped a roundabout and rolled. The car's roof shredded from the body. One tyre was found 400 metres from the intersection. The 4 passengers died at the scene, 2 boys and 2 girls.
4 young people have lost their lives. There are 4 families that will be grieving this evening, today, and for a long time to come. It is tragic beyond words.
The driver, a 14-year-old local boy, somehow managed to escape with only minor injuries. He has since been discharged from the Townsville Hospital.
It's a tragedy for the children involved, and it's a tragedy for their families, and it's also confronting to first responders who attend these incidents.
Police say there were reports of 2 stolen cars driving dangerously around Townsville last night. Officers spotted the Kia Sorento shortly before the crash.
At no stage did the police pursue that vehicle or try and intercept that vehicle.
The Ethical Standards Command will oversee the investigation into the incident. Lucy Murray, SBS World News.
Coming up next, a deadly shark attack. Police praise the heroism of 2 men who tried to fend off the ocean predator. Also, which country is bracing for a possible explosion in COVID-19 cases? And later, did German police ignore warnings about the prime suspect in the Madeleine McCann case? Police have praised the heroism of 2 surfers who tried to fend off a great white shark as it mauled a man in the waters off northern New South Wales. But despite their best efforts, he couldn't be saved. The attack happened at Salt Beach, south of Kingscliff. The predator, which isn't tagged, has now disappeared.
In the waters off Kingscliff, police scour the shallows. The 3-metre great white, responsible for killing a male surfer, was filmed from above, but managed to evade surf lifesavers.
Yeah, completely shocked, eh? Like, you don't see that kind of stuff happen too often, so yeah, it's just crazy to hear that news. Very sad.
Pretty shocked. Yeah, because it's a pretty safe part of the beach here, so strange to see that happen.
The man was surfing in a group when he was bitten on the left thigh. He was given first aid on the beach, but couldn't be saved.
Due to his injuries, a significant wound to his left thigh, he was deceased at the scene.
Police say 2 surfers, the victim's friend and a stranger, came to his rescue, fighting off the shark before bringing him to shore.
Their actions were nothing short of heroic.
Police are yet to identify the man believed to be a 60-year-old from Queensland. The attack sparking a frantic clearing of the water.
We happened to be surfing probably 10 minutes down the road. The Queensland Lifesaving, or the Lifesaving, came down the jet ski, told us to hop out.
Beaches between Kingscliff and Cabarita will remain closed for 24 hours as the Marine Area Command continues its search for the shark.
This is the first shark attack within the Tweed Coast for a long period of time.
If it's found, it could be tagged or euthanased. Nakari Thorpe, SBS World News.
The bodies of 2 people, one of them a 5-year-old boy, have been recovered after a boat capsized north of Wollongong. A police helicopter and rescue boat spotted the vessel upturned in the water. The body of the child was later discovered by police divers. And another body has been pulled from the water but is yet to be formally identified. Surf lifesavers say heavy seas made for unfavourable conditions.
that reef and the rock platforms out there, the swells was pumping through quite large there last night. And unfortunately, if you're not familiar with the area, it may have caught the person off guard driving the vessel.
2 other men aged in their 20s and 30s were rescued last night and taken to hospital. They've since been released. A trip away has turned to tragedy after fire tore through a home in the Victorian town of Tyack, north of Melbourne. 2 people were killed in the blaze, among them a 6-year-old boy. 11 people were taken to hospital with injuries in total. 4 children are currently in the Royal Children's Hospital in a critical condition. An investigation into the circumstances is underway. Well, there were 5 new COVID-19 cases recorded in Australia today. One of them in the ACT, the territory's first positive case in more than a month. There are 4 others in Victoria. 3 are returned travellers who have been in hotel quarantine. The 4th case is a household contact linked to an outbreak at a McDonald's in Melbourne's north. The COVID-19 pandemic has fuelled a dramatic spike in the number of Australians experiencing financial hardship from job losses or reduced hours and wages. A new study has found employment stress levels among families have more than doubled, and it's children that could bear the long-term brunt.
The lines stretching outside Centrelink offices have painted a bleak picture of the impact the coronavirus has had on the Australian job market.
It hit, and it hit really hard.
The drop-off in employment has been huge. It's been sudden and it's been unprecedented.
And a new study by policy think tank the Mitchell Institute has found children are bearing the brunt.
We've now got a generation of kids that are growing up in highly stressed households. Are they able to pay for school camps? Are they going to school with a full tummy? Those sorts of things are really significant issues. And we know that for a number of families, those issues already existed, but we have a huge new cohort of families that are finding themselves in those circumstances.
The report found the number of kindergarten and school children in homes experiencing job stress rose from 615,000 in 2016 to 1.4 million this year. The biggest increases were in the Kinglake region north of Melbourne and the Sydney suburban areas of Sutherland, Pittwater, Rouse Hill and Cronulla.
Also regional areas outside of capital cities where parents are more likely to be working in jobs that are affected by COVID-19 shutdowns.
According to the report, there's a strong correlation between education outcomes and job losses in families. A child with an unemployed parent has a 15% greater chance of repeating a grade and is also far more likely to leave school early and not go to university. The Victorian Council of Social Services says agencies are struggling to cope with a 25% increase in demand for help from families.
The worry here is that it's got a very long tail. So we know that there's some support in place at the moment around JobKeeper and JobSeeker. That support is meant to end around September. I don't know what people are meant to do at that point in time.
While battling Australian families have been largely spared the deadly health extremes of the pandemic, their financial challenges may be far from over. Gareth Boreham, SBS World News.
Globally, the number of confirmed COVID-19 cases is approaching 7 million, with outbreaks in Latin America and the United States making up nearly half of those. Nearly 400,000 people have died around the world and 3 million have recovered. But there are growing concerns for India, which has just recorded 10,000 new infections, a record one-day spike. India has now surpassed Spain as the 5th worst hit country, but the government is going ahead with the easing of restrictions.
In the mountains of northern India, a baby is born into a burgeoning public health crisis.
I expect no one can help me, but without expecting, I get lots of help and support.
His mother, so grateful for her healthy baby, she named him Quarantino. From the regions into the cities of India, the world's biggest lockdown is easing. The government allowing shops and restaurants to open their doors tomorrow. Health professionals say it's happening far too soon.
Projections are for 15,000 new cases a day by next week. India's biggest cities bearing the brunt of an outbreak that's only expected to get worse. Hospitals there have been told to stockpile 3 months' worth of PPE and oxygen masks. In Brazil, where the spread of coronavirus is so pervasive it's reaching some of the Amazon's most isolated tribes, the government shut down its own website that tracks the country's case numbers. President Jair Bolsonaro has defended the controversial decision, tweeting that the data didn't reflect the moment the country was in. Defensive too on his threat to pull out of the WHO, all as Brazil confirms 645,000 cases.
Either the WHO works with ideological impartiality or we are out. We don't need outsiders weighing in on health here.
As for the outsiders here in Colombia, they're Venezuelans, all trying to get home. More than 1,000 migrants left jobless and homeless, forced to build makeshift camps on the outskirts of Bogota. Venezuela is limiting the number of people crossing its borders because of COVID-19 fears, leaving migrants stranded and vulnerable.
Que no dejen pasar a todos, todos quieren estar en su casa, con su familia.
But even where the worst of the pandemic seems to be over, its effects are still being felt. In Italy, right-wing protesters clashed with police, angry at the government's handling of the crisis, demanding the resignation of the country's president.
Per far capire al mondo intero che ogni categoria oggi in Italia è devastata e distrutta da un governo che di fatto non sta facendo gli interessi degli italiani.
The country, once considered the coronavirus hotspot of the world, recorded another 72 deaths overnight. Amelia Dunn, SBS World News.
Well, as we just reported, India will be reopening large parts of the country starting tomorrow. Let's cross now to reporter Neha Punia. She is in Delhi. Neha, is India well placed to be relaxing COVID-19 measures now?
There are a lot of reservations and concerns, and many are asking whether the government is reopening the economy in haste, whether it's prioritizing saving livelihoods over saving lives. All of this week we saw a massive spike in COVID-19 cases, but experts are warning that the worst is yet to come. The coming week we might see 15,000 cases every single day. Many experts have called the government's reopening plan incoherent. They're saying, what's the need, for example, to reopen religious places in the middle of a pandemic? And they're saying that as more people step outside their homes, there will be an even bigger surge in cases in the days ahead. Now, the government claims that the reason why we are seeing more cases coming to light is because they're testing more, and they plan to double their testing capacity to 200,000 tests a day by the end of this month. But experts say they disagree. They believe that community transmissions have already begun in India, something that the government is denying, and they're warning that unless the government gets ahead of containing this virus, of limiting the movement of people, India is going to see far many more cases in the months ahead, with the country not yet having hit its COVID-19 peak.
And Neha, you are in Delhi, a city of 11 million people. Can you paint a picture for us of the situation there?
Delhi has the third biggest COVID-19 outbreak in India, but now the situation here is getting worse by every passing day. In this week, we saw Delhi recording more cases than Mumbai, which currently has India's largest COVID-19 outbreak. The government has also expressed concern, saying that the situation in Delhi is worrying. They're blaming low testing, poor surveillance, and lax implementation of the lockdown measures as one of the reasons why we've seen so many cases here in the last 2 to 3 days. One of the biggest changes that the government has now implemented is it's going to be tracking people entering the city-state more closely. Prior to this week, anyone flying into the city or taking a train or a bus didn't have to mandatorily quarantine himself or herself. They could just go home and self-monitor their symptoms. But the government, now recognizing the fact that there's been a worrying surge in cases, is saying that a 7-day quarantine period is absolutely compulsory.
Okay, Neha Punia in Delhi, thank you. Still to come, the fight against COVID-19 in a remote corner of the Amazon rainforest. What are the chances of survival when the nearest hospital is 8 hours downstream? We'll have that special report shortly. And in the US, health officials are fearing a new peak of the coronavirus, the health crisis colliding with the Black Lives Matter protests. 18 states are reporting a spike in cases, but demonstrators say time is of the essence and they can't afford to wait.
In New York, marching side by side, masks on, but defying warnings about spreading COVID-19. Protesters like Courtney Walker weighing up people power versus the health risks for her two small sons.
This is worth the risk because if I didn't come down here today, their lives are in danger every day. So it's worth the risk to come down to make sure that change is effective. Mask, gloves.
In Washington Square Park, Samantha Law handed out protective gear.
There's strength in numbers. It's important to gather during this time and do it safely. We can't afford to wait. We can't.
But medical experts now telling protesters masks may not be enough to protect them, and tear gas and pepper spray could accelerate the virus's spread.
Lots of people in close contact yelling and screaming can propel the virus, and 35 to 50% of patients with COVID can be infected and asymptomatic. There's a real concern for viral resurgence.
18 states are reporting a rise in cases, including South Carolina with its highest single-day increase, and Florida topping 1,000 new cases for the fourth day in a row. America's Health Protection Agency is warning the US could see 143,000 deaths before the end of this month. Several cities with high protest numbers now opening up free testing sites. Seattle expanding its eligibility to all demonstrators, whether or not they have symptoms. New York officials too recommending everyone get a free test while commending a drop in the daily death toll to 35, its lowest number in 2 months.
We used to talk about flattening the curve. We went beyond that in New York. We didn't flatten the curve, we bent the curve.
The city's health department telling protesters to assume they've been exposed to COVID-19 and get tested within 5 days. And to limit yelling and chanting by using drums or other noise. It's a big ask for those who say
they don't want us to be heard. But we singing loud and clear and we blowing our horns.
Christine Carney, SBS World News.
British police say they've received more than 400 tip-offs relating to the case of missing girl Madeleine McCann after a new suspect was named on Wednesday. The response of German police is also under fresh scrutiny following reports they failed to follow up on tip-offs naming Christian Bruckner as a key suspect.
For more than a decade, the residents of Praia da Luz, a small sleepy town in Portugal's Algarve region, have lived in the shadow cast by Madeleine McCann's disappearance.
It would be great if we could get to that point that, it's solved and it's resolved and people can move on.
This investigation spans several countries, with chief suspect Christian Bruckner, a German national, also linked to at least 2 other missing children. German police believe he murdered Madeleine, having lived in Portugal between 1997 and 2007.
He was one of those hippie-looking people who visited us often. I didn't even know he spent some time in our country in the past. He showed up here. I saw him once or 3 times.
Christian Bruckner is currently serving time for sexual assault. German media now asking questions about why police didn't act sooner on tip-offs he was involved in the McCann case. In 2013, McCann's parents made a public plea for information on German television. National newspaper Der Spiegel says Braunschweig police received several tip-offs from locals about Bruckner. The paper says that local police report was ignored by federal authorities. Bruckner is also linked to the disappearance of Inga Gericke in 2015. When police raided his house in 2016, they found a USB stick of child pornography, but no signs of the girl. This lawyer represents Inga's father.
It's always when every few months or every few years new evidences in our case appears, it is something between hope that his daughter is still alive and resignation that she might be dead already.
British police believe Madeleine McCann is still alive. Operation Grange is an ongoing missing persons case, and appeals for information from the public have yielded over 400 tip-offs so far. But the incremental nature of these investigations means answers are likely many months away. Naveen Razik, SBS World News.
Chile is ranked as the safest country in South America, but crime is soaring along with unemployment as the country grapples with COVID-19, prompting poorer communities to demand protection.
Armed assailants on roads and highways stop drivers to rob them. Gangs of young men and women force people out of their cars to steal their vehicles in broad daylight. Police breaking down doors looking for culprits. This isn't new, but since COVID-19 and lockdowns arrived in Chile, people say they feel less safe. 24-year-old Eric Kellinghausen recently became one of the latest statistics while walking home from work through this park.
A guy appeared with a face mask like we all wear now and pointed a gun at my head. Give it to me, he shouted. I was in too much shock to react until he threatened to fire the gun. Then I gave him my mobile phone.
Muggings have increased all over the capital, Santiago. Drug traffickers are hiring deliverymen to transport drugs instead of fast food because they're allowed to operate during quarantine. But organized crime is making far more sinister inroads, especially in Chile's poorest areas. Tina runs one of at least 70 soup kitchens that have sprung up in La Pintana, a municipality where COVID infections are soaring as fast as unemployment. Many here have been out of work for at least 2 months. A community organizer helps raise donations to provide 200 lunches a day. But in many poor-income neighborhoods, authorities say that there is growing evidence, which has been confirmed to us by some locals who declined to be on camera, that organized crime is now beginning to try to play the role of Robin Hood. They're doing this by giving away food or financing some of these soup kitchens in a bid to win over the hearts and minds, or at least the loyalty, of people in desperate need. La Pintana's mayor says they also want to win the locals' silence.
What I've seen is that they're giving away food to people who are infected with COVID-19, and they use the social networks to publicize what they're doing.
The director of Public Security and Order tells us police are responding to the crime wave by installing hundreds of new cameras and drones to gather intelligence in real time.
During quarantine and curfew, it's more complex for the common delinquent to carry out traditional crimes, so they're resorting to more serious crimes, and that generates more violence.
Indeed, criminals here are becoming increasingly bold, which raises another concern, that in times like these of deep recession and need, many could be tempted to believe that resorting to crime is justifiable when you have a family to feed.
Staying in South America, Indigenous communities in the Amazon are struggling to combat coronavirus. Residents in the remote village of Camito in Peru's rainforest are suffering due to a lack of resources, but not everyone there is taking the threat seriously.
Monday morning in a remote Shipibo village in Peru's central Amazon. We're 8 hours by river from the nearest hospital. The local medical post is packed with people waiting to be treated.
Dolor de cabeza, dolor de cuerpo, de todo lo que no podía caminar también, por eso no he venido.
Here, nearly everybody has COVID-19 symptoms. Inside, there are only 2 nurses and 1 assistant for 750 people that live in the community. The head doctor abandoned his post when the pandemic started, leaving Elias, a Shipibo nurse, in charge. He's trying his best with what he has.
Los medicamentos esenciales que nos ha dado el Ministerio de Salud, ya en estos 3-4 días ya se nos agotó totalmente. No contamos con analgésicos de paracetamol.
The queue outside is for those able to walk. but many others are stuck in bed. Elias has come to check on Reina, a 32-year-old man who has been sick for the past 2 weeks. There are more than 10 severe cases in this village. This is the front line against COVID-19 in the remote Amazon.
¿Cómo sabes que es COVID?
Porque estaba con todos los síntomas y por la debilidad que él siente no puede levantarse.
Caimito is one of hundreds of communities in the Amazon now affected by the pandemic. Here, 4 people have died with COVID-19 symptoms in the past few days. This adds to the death toll of hundreds in the whole region.
Nearly 80% of the population in this village is infected, according to medical staff. And with the nearest hospital 8 hours downstream, those who develop a critical condition have very few chances of surviving.
And 8 hours downstream in Pucallpa, this is what you have. People dying at the hospital doors. Inside there are no beds left. Patients hold on to their lives. Others are in a very poor state.
This is the COVID area in one of the main hospitals of Pucallpa. Doctors here have to work 12 to 18-hour shifts under 40 degrees Celsius. The heat under these suits is practically unbearable. You feel like the mask is melting in your face.
Back in Caimito, the Evangelical Church has organized a service. Elias, our nurse, did not show up at the church. He did not agree with social gathering. The next morning, he decides to make his own statement.
Seguimos desobedeciendo las órdenes del gobierno. Si nosotros no tomamos las medidas necesarias, vamos a seguir muriendo.
If communities like Caimito continue to be neglected by the authorities and carry on as normal, Elias' fears might become a reality.
Coming up next, the fight to save this small patch of bushland. It survived the fires but is now at risk of being bulldozed. And pushing for change, American NFL stars speaking out after years of being silenced. The federal government will continue to underwrite domestic flights until the end of September, with financial support for regional air routes extended until the year's end. The funding to keep Qantas, Virgin and Brex flights in the air is part of more than $1.2 billion poured into aviation during COVID-19.
We're not just necessarily propping up airlines, but we're doing that at the same time. But we are actually protecting regional communities and Australians by this minimum network extension.
Last week, Qantas announced it will scale up its domestic schedule ahead of the possible relaxing of border restrictions in July. A bushfire-impacted community on the New South Wales South Coast is demanding the government strengthen Australia's environment laws to better protect nature from land clearing and development. SBS reporter Cassandra Bain reports from the town of Manana, where residents say a proposed housing project on unburnt bushland could lead to the extinction of native wildlife.
Rural Fire Service volunteer Bill Eager helped save hundreds of homes in the New South Wales South Coast summer bushfires. Now he has another battle to fight to stop development of a 20-hectare block of forest in Manana. He says it's one of the last pockets of unburnt bushland in the area.
We have to stop this piece of ground here from being bulldozed because this piece of ground is a source. It's a Noah's Ark, really, of what's left.
Local residents protesting the proposed housing development, approved more than 10 years ago, say the site is a wildlife refuge for threatened species, including the greater glider, which has since been listed as vulnerable.
Save our bush! Save our bush!
In a last-ditch attempt to halt construction, the group took the developer, Aussie Homes, to federal court, where they were granted a temporary reprieve.
We've got an undertaking from the developer that he will at least give us 14 days notice before they recommence works. It's going to take at least a 12-month assessment, just as a preliminary.
Australian actor Claudia Carvin has showed her support, releasing this video on social media calling on the Federal Environment Department to intervene.
We urgently need the government to step up and protect what's left. So this is particularly significant. It has mature trees that are crucial for wildlife and our ecosystems.
Environment Minister Susan Lee says the department has requested the opportunity to review the results of the ecological surveys, and the information will assist in determining whether the project impacts should be referred under the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. Residents are now pushing for the local, state and federal governments to buy back the land from the developer and turn it into a nature reserve. They say it's a small price to pay to ensure the survival of some of Australia's most threatened native wildlife.
This would be a wonderful example of how the three levels of government and the community and the developer can all get together and really preserve this little parcel for the animals, for the people.
We're very protective of this bush, and we think that the laws should be changed.
The group says it hopes their campaign will help to prevent other bushfire-impacted areas across the country from being cleared or developed. Aussie Homes did not respond to requests for comment. Cassandra Bain, SBS World News.
Players from NFL franchise the Denver Broncos have led community members in a peaceful protest in Colorado. American sporting figures continue to rally around the Black Lives Matter movement, using their profile and influence to speak out against racial inequality.
Addressing the anguish of America's black community without fear of reprisal. Overnight, the NFL's Denver Broncos led thousands in a Black Lives Matter protest in Colorado. Empowered athletes becoming leaders for their communities and powerful agents of change.
Trying to learn what we've been going through our whole life, and it's sending out a very powerful message to see everybody walking the streets.
In the not-so-distant past, athlete activism put careers and livelihoods at stake. In 1992, Chicago Bulls NBA star Craig Hodges visited the White House wearing a traditional African dashiki. He presented a letter to President George Bush decrying the treatment of African Americans. Subsequently released by the Bulls, Hodges didn't play in the NBA again.
I have taken on the responsibility to speak on behalf of those who are not able to be heard.
His teammate Michael Jordan has pledged $143 million over the next 10 years to help organisations fight racial inequality. At the peak of his career, he inspired millions on the court, but at the time avoided political commentary.
Because of the commercial viability that occurred, the greater commercial viability that occurred by virtue of being raceless, apolitical, by the idea that you weren't engaged in these kinds of activities.
In 2016, the issue of player activism came back into the American national psyche via the NFL. San Francisco 49ers quarterback Colin Kaepernick famously lost his job for kneeling against racial injustice.
This might not be something I experience on a daily basis, but it's not right that these other people are going through this.
4 years later, amid nationwide demonstrations, reinvigorated player power has now elicited a league response.
We will not be silenced.
We assert our right to peacefully protest.
We were wrong for not listening to NFL players earlier and encourage all to speak out and peacefully protest.
Some commentators labelling the concession as no more than a PR stunt.
Roger Goodell is afraid that the same protests that have gripped our cities across America will grip NFL stadiums when NFL season begins.
President Donald Trump repeatedly engages in the debate, strongly advocating against player protests. But athletes around the world are acting in solidarity, helping empower others to speak out. Joel Spreadborough, SBS World News.
NRL Commissioner Peter Vlandis is campaigning for the New South Wales State Government to allow crowds of up to 15,000 back into stadiums from the beginning of July. It follows the approval for limited numbers of supporters to return to corporate areas in New South Wales stadiums from next Thursday.
Forced to walk away from the stadium this weekend, it'll be a different story for some lucky NRL fans next weekend.
Go Power! It's great that fans can get back there and, enjoy what it is that we enjoy, the football.
The NRL will present its biosecurity plan to the New South Wales government early next week, and the safety protocols seen at Parramatta's Leagues Club will likely be used at Western Sydney Stadium when the Eels play Penrith on Friday.
The Eels had a look at our safety plan as well, and I believe that's been considered over at the stadium, so I'm familiar with the measures they have in place. But we're all trying to make do as best we can.
It's important to, in these times, to make sure we're handling the virus and making sure we're not spreading it. So, but it's great to have it back. Yeah, no, it's fantastic.
If I can manage to swing away in there, I'd take that opportunity, absolutely.
For fans of other codes, such as AFL, the wait to return to action will go on a little longer.
The AFL has established a Return to Crowds committee in the hope that their supporters can be back as early as next month.
Let's go Giants!
Certainly we're more hopeful now than we were a few weeks ago. And as restrictions continue to ease up, then we're getting just a little bit closer every day, I think.
And although the NRL has got its fan plan up and running, it was the GWS Giants that came up with the idea.
It's the Giants that raised that possibility of the corporate dining areas being classed as restaurants and therefore 50 people being able to get into each of them. And certainly that's something that, even if it doesn't work in Melbourne, it can work here.
Whatever the code, fans are gearing up for their return to the action. John Baldock, SBS World News.
Tennis and men's world number one Novak Djokovic believes it will be impossible for the US Open to proceed under the current proposed coronavirus safety protocols. The hard-court Grand Slam is due to begin in New York on August the 31st. But Djokovic has labelled the intended safety restrictions, including limits to player support staff, as extreme. World number two, Rafael Nadal, has said he is not currently prepared to travel abroad for tournaments due to global health fears. Coming up, the weather and the World War II veterans who've cycled the width of the English Channel without leaving home. The weather, major centres, showers in Sydney, mostly sunny in Melbourne, grey skies in Brisbane and Adelaide, while Canberra gets some early fog, sunny for Perth. Further afield, fine in Wellington and Christchurch, thunder in Nandi, showers in Tahiti. In Southeast Asia, thunder in Singapore and Kuala Lumpur, partly cloudy in Jakarta, drizzle in Denpasar, thunder for Bangkok. Further north, cloudy for Beijing and Hanoi, a wet day for Hong Kong, Manila and Taipei. Clouds for Shanghai, Tokyo and Seoul will have a fine day. Heading west, fine in Baghdad and Beirut, windy in Delhi, partly cloudy in Islamabad and Tehran. Some thunder in Mumbai, a fine day in Jerusalem. Europe sees clouds for London, partly cloudy in Madrid. A few showers in Paris, rain in Rome, clear skies in Athens, rain in Belgrade. In Africa, rain in Addis Ababa, showers in Algiers, fine in Cairo and Johannesburg, grey skies over Dakar, some rain for Casablanca, showers in Nairobi. In South America, rain for Caracas, Bogota, La Paz and Asuncion. Foggy in Buenos Aires, partly cloudy in Rio de Janeiro and Santiago. And for North America, fine in Los Angeles, Toronto and New York, showers in Miami and Mexico City. Well, since the start of last year, it's estimated more than 150 newsrooms across Australia have closed. But as many media organisations reduce their operations, it's a different story for some of Australia's multicultural newspapers.
The Australasian Muslim Times is flourishing after its relaunch in 2014.
We had a pouring in of advertising from organisations, businesses, Muslim organisations, non-Muslim organisations, government, and even messages from police.
Written by volunteers and packed by school children, it's one of many community newspapers bucking the trend.
People want to open the newspaper and see themselves visually represented. The newspaper is quite high quality content. It's got beautiful images.
A strong digital strategy has been key to its success, as well as providing a range of perspectives. 50% of its readers aren't Muslim.
So you're not just hearing an insular voice
on the Muslim opinion on others. You're getting other people to explain, to have a voice and to have a say. And that's fantastic.
Il Globo and La Fiamma have serviced Australia's Italian community for more than half a century. 100,000 copies of the bi-weekly newspaper are distributed nationwide every 7 days. A loyal readership has led to consistent support from advertisers.
That's why probably we are still alive and we are able to survive even in this difficult economic environment.
A monthly edition is also now produced for school children.
It's all about connecting young people, young students, and trying to build this kind of relationship with us.
Multicultural newspapers continue to provide a point of difference in the Australian media.
Mainstream Australian English language media does not resemble what our multicultural society looks like in any meaningful form.
And the importance of these publications isn't lost on the nation's leaders. Adrian Archuli, SBS World News.
2 British veterans who fought in the Second World War have cycled over 160 kilometres in quarantine to mark the 76th anniversary of D-Day. Using a gym bike, 96-year-old Len Gibbon began the challenge on May the 8th, VE Day, to cover the distance across the channel from Portsmouth to Gold Beach, one of the Allied invasion sites. He was joined by fellow Normandy veteran, 95-year-old Peter Hawkins, who also completed the challenge. The two, cycling on separate occasions to comply with social distancing, raising funds for a veterans' charity. The feat has drawn comparisons to the efforts of Sir Tom Moore, who completed 100 laps of his garden ahead of his 100th birthday to raise money for Britain's National Health Service. With widespread anti-racism protests, children may have noticed that the streets on our screens aren't like Sesame Street. Elmo and his furry monster friends try to explain.
I want you a picture of what Elmo wants. All of us loving each other. Elmo can do better.
I can do better.
I can do better.
I can do better.
Organisers hope the hour-long TV special can help children make sense of current events. SBS Current Affairs show The Feed is asking Australians how they're feeling during the COVID-19 crisis. They've set up a hotline for people to call, and the messages and home videos have been flooding in from people right across Australia. Tonight we present Tanya's story.
So my name's Tanya Natalie and I own the Bookplate Bookshop in Hornsby. I started working there in 2007 and in 2009 I bought the place with my dad. As soon as we bought the shop, he said to me, when I was younger, I'd always dreamed about being an old man pottering about in my very own bookshop. And, you know, he gets to do that now. One day I was like, how can I get these books to still have a little bit of that magic in, you know, finding or deciding or choosing a book? And I think that's when I came up with the whole personality-based book bundle. People will answer 6 questions, and it's, you know, what type of person are they? And it's also, do they like olives or do they hate olives? And basically what I do is figure out what kind of books they might like. I'm getting so many really beautiful emails from people saying thank you so much for coming up with this idea and for doing this during this time, because it's given them something to like look forward to and to really get excited about.
That was one of the voice memos sent to The Feed as part of its Coping Through COVID-19 project. To add your voice and your story, call 1-800-THE-FEED. That's 1-800-843-333. And that is The World this Sunday. If you missed some of tonight's bulletin, you can catch up on the SBS News website shortly. And you can also watch the bulletin live there or on our app. I'll be back with updates throughout the evening. I'm Ricardo Goncalves. Good night.